again. Time for another bout with math. Oh, we're supposed to be positive about this. So, another lesson. Today we're going to talk about multiplying and dividing with negative numbers. Last time we talked about adding and subtracting them. And so we're going to talk about multiplying and dividing them. We're going to do the same kind of thing we did before, where we're going to take some actual examples so that we can convince our brains that, yes, this is how the rule works, rather than just telling you what the rule is. For example, if you are losing $20 a week, now that's going to be negative, right? So we're going to talk about minus 20. 4 weeks from now, where will you be as far financially as compared to where you are now? So during those 4 weeks, you're going to be losing that minus $20 every week. So at the end of that time, you will be at negative 80. Okay? Now the next thing we're going to look at is kind of a little bit of a reverse thing, but I want the idea to show both ways so that your brain will understand this and accept that it's true. Now let's suppose that you've been losing that $20 that we talked about here, but now we're going back in time. No, let's see, I don't want to say that. Let's say 4 weeks ago, let's say you're gaining $20 a week. Okay, let's get this right. You're gaining $20 a week. Now we're going back in time. So gaining $20 a week will, of course, be a positive. But now when we go back in time, 4 weeks, we're going to represent that relative to the present. We're going to represent that as negative 4 weeks. Okay, now when we go back 4 weeks, what was your financial situation then compared to what it is now? Well, for those last 4 weeks, you haven't been getting that extra $20. So back then, you were actually $80 less off than what you are now. So if you look at that, can you tell what the rule is as far as multiplying positive and negative numbers? Okay, so when we multiply one negative times one positive, we get a negative result. I'm going to write that up here in the corner. A positive times a negative is going to equal to a negative. Everybody clear on that? Okay, so now let's look at the other way this might go. Let's say, now I'm going to get back to where I started to go, where my brain wandered off. You've been losing $20 a week, and of course, that's negative. But now what we're going to do is we're going to go back in time 4 weeks. So this is going to be a negative 4. Now we're not talking about subtracting, but we're actually talking about multiplying. $20 a week is what you've been losing. We're going back in time, so that's going to give us the 4 times. But now, where were you 4 weeks ago, excuse me, compared to where you are now if you've been losing $20 a week every week? 4 weeks ago, you hadn't lost those $20 that you've lost. So that would make it positive 80. You were actually $80 better off 4 weeks ago than where you are now. Okay? So what's the rule going to be when we multiply two negatives? Or a negative times a negative is going to be equal to a positive. Now one of the reasons that I talk about this is because how many of you have been taught two negatives don't make a positive? And yet, here we are talking about product of two negatives being a positive. That's the way it is. And so even though it might be a little bit of a challenge to get your brain to accept it, that is the reality. So, positive times a negative is a negative. Negative times a negative is a positive. Okay, now then, what would happen if we multiplied three negatives? Let's just take an example. Let's say we have a negative 2 times a negative 3 times a negative 5. Well, it's all multiplication, so we just do it as we come to it. So what's going to be the sign for this first multiplication we've got here? Got a negative times a negative. That's going to make it a positive. So we're going to have a positive 6 times a negative 5. Okay, when we multiply a positive 6 times a negative 5, what are we going to get? Positive times a negative equals a negative. So that's going to be a negative. So when we multiply three negatives, we end up with a negative result. In general, if there were an even number of negatives, what would our sign be? Well, if there are an even number of negatives, for every 2 that I have, I'm going to get a positive. Since I've got an even number, whatever that even number is, it will be divisible by 2. So I can take all those negatives and break them down into groups of 2 negatives, each of which will be positive. So if you want a general rule that will always be true, then we can make that a little more specific. Even number of negatives will be a positive. I make that look like what it's supposed to look like. Will be a positive. An even number of negatives will be a positive. What about an odd number? Well, whatever the odd number is, let's take an odd number like 13. If I take 1 off of that, I get an even number. So the even number will be a positive. There's going to be that one little sneaky negative that's going to sneak in there and mess up the whole thing. Turn the whole thing negative. So if I have an odd number of negatives, I'm always going to get a negative. Okay? That's pretty simple and straightforward. Even number, it's always going to be positive. Odd number, it's going to be negative. Now, to remember, to think about that, let me just show you what you can do with this information. Well, we can try some examples. Let's just try some example problems. When I have something like this, -1 times -3 times -2 times 2. Let's say that's our problem. I've mentioned this before, and I think it's really important to do this. Whenever you're dealing with any kind of a problem in math, what you want to do is focus first on getting the signs. Somehow it's easy for us to work with numbers, but when we start playing around with negatives, it just doesn't come through as clearly as we would like. So when we look at this problem, we're going to figure out what the sign is first. And how do we do that? We look at the number of negatives. We have 1, 2, 3. We ask ourselves, if we're talking about 3, is that odd or even? Okay, it's odd. So what's our sign going to be? All right, so then we're going to write the sign down here, and we don't worry about it anymore because we've already got our sign. Now we're going to focus on the numbers. We've got 1 times 3, which is 3, times 2, which is 6, times 2, which is 12, and our answer is -12. Okay, so if you can remember that, then that's something you can do. Now, what about division? Well, let's see about division. How did we define division? Division is multiplication, except it's multiplication by the inverse. So what's the rule of signs going to be for division? Okay, it's multiplication. So the rule's going to be the same. That means if we have an even number of negatives, we're going to get a positive result. If we have an odd number of negatives, we're going to get a negative result. Of course, with division, that's a little bit nicer and easier to work with because we only divide two numbers at a time. So that's the biggest we have to worry about. But let's take a look at an example we might have to deal with. If I have negative 8 divided by 2, first of all, what's the sign going to be? One negative, one is odd, so my answer is going to be negative. 8 divided by 4 is 2. Oops. 8 divided by 2 is 4. Let's pay attention to what we're doing here. Like I always say, stay focused. I don't care who you are. If you don't stay focused, you can get messed up. What would happen if I had 8 divided by negative 2? Okay, question is, what's the sign going to be? Well, how many negatives do we have? 1. What's that going to make it? Negative. 8 divided by 2 is 4. And we get negative 4 for our answer. So whether I divide negative 8 by 2 or 8 by negative 2, I get the same result. What do you think would happen if I just wrote the negative out in front? Well, how many signs are there? How many negatives are there? One negative. Again, it's odd. So the answer is going to be negative, and I have 8 divided by 2. Now another way to look at that may make it just a little bit clearer. If you look at that, remember that sign we used to talk about opposites? It's the opposite of, or the negative of, 8 divided by 2. So even if you just say it that way, you can see that it's going to be negative. So that rule, if there's one negative, it doesn't matter where it is in division. If there's one negative, it's going to be a negative result. That's all we care about. Okay, some other things just to make sure of, just quickly, doesn't have necessarily to do with signs, but some other things we need to understand. If I have some number, I don't care what it is, let's say 5 times 0. What's that equal to? Now that, for some of you that's going to be really obvious. You'll wonder why you even bother with that. But for some reason, some people when they think of 0, they don't quite get a clear picture of what it is as far as multiplying and other things. So what I want you to think about is how much do we have if we have 0? Think of a word you could put in there. Anybody come up with nothing? So if I have nothing, what would I have if I had 5 times that much? In other words, what's 5 times nothing? Okay, so I think if you think about it that way, you won't have trouble with that. Anytime you multiply any number by 0, it's always going to be 0. Dividing by 0 is a little different game. If I have 5 divided by nothing, our brain has a little trouble with this. Some people want to call it 5. Some people want to call it 0. Well, let's see whether or not these make any sense. Now remember, anytime you divide a number by another one, the resulting quotient, if you multiply that quotient by the divisor, multiply those two numbers together, you get the number you started with. So, I mean, you can see it if I have 6 divided by 3 is equal to 2. 2 times 3 is 6. But if you thought it was 5, then what you're saying is 5 times nothing equals 5? Okay, we just said 5 times 0 or 5 times nothing is nothing. So that can't possibly be true. Okay, this one would say 0 times 0 is equal to 5. Is it? Not last time I checked. So that's not equal to either. So what we find out when we divide by nothing or by 0, the result is such a big, huge number that we don't have any idea what it is. So anytime you have some number divided by 0, we just say it's undefined. And what we mean when we say that is just that number's so big we don't have any idea what it is. And sometime we might go through that so you can see exactly how that works. But that's just some couple of little things to add on here so that you know what we got. Even number of negatives is a negative, or positive. Odd numbers are negative. And that's the same for multiplication and division. When you multiply by 0, you get 0. When you divide by 0, we have no idea what it is. And so we don't worry about it. We just say, whenever you see something like that, we just say it's undefined. Okay. Hope that was helpful for you. Remember, get it in your mind. Get the idea down to where it becomes automatic, because then when you're working with problems and you got signs involved, you just get your sign first of all. You look at it, you'll be able to figure out what it is, write it down, and then go ahead with the work, and it avoids some of the problems that people sometimes run into. Hope that was helpful. See you later. Thank you.